and thank you very much for having me today. Just to double check, can everyone hear me with that? Real raised hands, that's perfect. Now, firstly, it's my pleasure here to talk to you about the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the organisation I have the honour of working for, and also a pressure to follow on from Chris's earlier fine work with the AGM as well. Now, with those twofold pressures, I'm going to introduce to you tonight my organisation, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, by discussing firstly its origins as a heritage organisation. I'll then follow on to discuss our archives. Of course, you guys are spoken an awful lot about your records going in, looking into local history. And this is an opportunity to show you into our internationally recognised archives. Our archives cover everything to do with our organisation, everything from minutes of meetings when our organisation was first being founded, all the way up to casualty records and reports of employees that we've had in our 100-year existence. I'm going to then pick out a couple of gems I feel worth mentioning that will help to continue for me to tell that story before finally talking about how you can access the archives. And I've also tailored the last part of the presentation to locally here, where I'm hopefully going to tell you a story that will both fascinate and intrigue you, and also tell you about an opportunity to follow on, following this talk, follow on with another opportunity. I'm going to be, in essence, running an event locally that you may be interested in as well. But without further ado, I want to begin by talking about our origins and kick it off with a video. Now, don't worry, this video doesn't have any commentary. It's purely lovely atmospheric music and amazing photos to accompany. Enjoy. Now, hopefully with that video, you've just got a snapshot into the extraordinary sites that we have and we look after across the world. But this infographic really does give you that potted insight into what we do around the world. I'll pick out a few statistics. We care for 1.7 million casualties. We work in over 150 different countries across the world, 153 to be exact. And we look after 23,000 sites. Now, to look after our sites, we of course need an extraordinary amount of expertise. We have 850 plus gardeners employed with us. It makes us the largest horticultural organisation in the world. We also have 160 craftspeople that work with us. These are everyone from stonemasons to architects, everything it takes to maintain these extraordinary structures that you see, the likes of Thiepval Memorial or Thiepval Memorial, the Menin Gate, All of those large, monumental and magnificent memorials require a lot of work to look after them. And that's down to the expertise of our employees. Also, to sort of give you a snapshot into the casualties we look after, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, the youngest casualty we care for was just 14 years old. The oldest casualty we look after is 68 years old. But I know I'm not the only person in the room to recognise just the diversity of the casualties we look after, because they came from all corners of the world, and that's a point I'll be picking up on a little bit later on. But it just gives you a sense, having a look at those statistics on that infographic, quite the scale of the work that we have to undertake year in, year out. But it all had to begin somewhere. And it began with this gentleman on screen here. This is Sir Fabian Ware. Now, during the First World War, in fact, at the outbreak of the First World War, he signed up to be a frontline soldier. But you had to be a certain age to be fighting on the front lines, and instead, because he was too old, he became the commander of a British Red Cross unit. Now, you don't have to know an awful lot about the First World War to appreciate just how many casualties were sustained in the early stages of the First World War. So Fabian Ware would have been, whilst not on the front line of the trenches, on the front line just to see the damage inflicted on those young generations very early on. Now, perhaps most crucially, he realised not only the sheer scale and number of the casualties, but also what little was being offered to a soldier in death. If you think about any other conflict before the First World War, I think it's particularly hard to pick out any sites where there is a dedicated memorial or cemetery. There may be a few you can think of, but certainly not to the scale that we know today, courtesy of his idea right at the very beginning. So he began this argument with his superior officers that something needs to be done about this. We needed to make sure that every single casualty sustained on those front lines should be properly commemorated somewhere, whether that's a cemetery or whether that's a memorial, in order to acknowledge the sacrifice they had made at the time during the First World War. Now that idea, of course, snowballed. It was recognised as a very, very good idea by his superior officers, and it slowly snowballed into what became our Royal Charter in 1917, the establishment of the Imperial War Graves Commission. Now this gave Sir Fabian Ware the resources to begin bringing the minds together on how to go about this enormous task. This task that would eventually end up as those statistics you saw earlier, with 1.7 million casualties and 23,000 sites. That's everything from thinking about the type of headstones to the design of those headstones, to the kind of gardeners that we have to train in order to work in different environments across the world. Now that all began with that first one document. That defined the parameters of how to begin building these sites. Those parameters, there were kind of three key things: that all casualties should be commemorated somewhere, that place, whether it memorial or headstone, should be permanent, and that all casualties should be commemorated in equality as well. Now those ideas are of course echoed throughout our sites, and you'll see some examples of how that played out in due course. But I want to talk a little bit more specifically about a very important part of our organisation, and that is of course our archives, because our archives document everything from the very beginning. I've had the enormous honour of even holding the notepad Sir Fabian Ware drafted his letters in when he was beginning to put his ideas down on pen to paper. That notepad was the beginning of the organisation I couldn't be more honoured to work for. And that is obviously stored within our archives. Now, to kind of break it down into simple terms, there's two parts to our archives. The first part is our casualty archive. This contains the records and all the names of the casualties we care for. It contains documents noting where each individual casualty is commemorated or buried, and also right down to what is to be placed on those casualties' headstones if they are buried in a cemetery. Now, to give you an overall sense, our archive is made up of 10,000 items. Now on the other side of our archive, the sort of other half as it were, is the commission archive. Now this is everything to do with, as you can see on the screen, you've got administration files, you've got minutes of meetings, everything to do with our organisation and its development in the past 100 years. We were founded during the First World War. It wasn't until the latter stages of the First World War that our employees could begin to go out and assess the sites to make reports on the casualties that we needed to make sure were buried in cemeteries or commemorated on memorials. And so the other side of our archive is purely kind of organisational. It's fascinating to see the decisions behind the way we go about doing things. And I'm going to begin to delve in a little bit more on some anecdotes I've got a little bit later on in my presentation. But in simple terms, that is how our archive is formed. Now, to carry on firstly with the casualty archive, we have lots of documents stored in our archives, but if you've ever used our website online and searched a casualty in our website, you are using a digital version of that archive. And you can see on screen here, this is a screenshot of our website, and you've got the option to find war dead or explore the CWGC archive. That's the second part I was discussing only a moment ago. But it's to find the war dead that will lead you to this next page. This is a form where you can fill in as little or as much as you want about a casualty. Again, this is using that archive that's over 100 years old now to find a casualty buried, whether that be here in the UK or further afield around the world as well. Whilst I briefly speak of the UK, you may be surprised to hear that there are over 300,000 people commemorated here in the UK. It's easy to think that the wars were fought in other fields, be it France or Belgium, but there are so many casualties here in the UK as well to discover, and casualties even more local here, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on the presentation. But once you've entered or you've found someone you want to search, or even if it's just your own surname, you'll end up with a list of casualties that may be the hit you want. You'll get the information about the regiment they served with, their date of death, and also where they're commemorated as well. Now, should you delve a little deeper into choosing one of those casualties, this is the record you will get. It will list the name of that casualty, so in this case, Private Thomas Atkins. You'll see that he served with the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment, and the date of death and where he's buried in Lissenhook Military Cemetery. There'll also sometimes be additional information. Sometimes our casualties will be awarded medals and have citations. Sometimes there's just as much information as to who was the mother and father behind that casualty. At the very bottom, this is a work in progress for us. We're digitising a lot of those casualty records. So every single casualty record will have documents and information that will list where they're buried and what they have on their headstone as well. Now, all of this information is right at your fingertips. You don't have to be an expert to find it, but it's something we can all do, and I equally spend an enormous amount of my work hours on sifting through casualties that fascinate me too. Now, just to talk about the other side, a lot of our organisational documents have also been digitised, and they're again searchable through our records. Our archives are visitable, and you can go and read those original documents, see Sir Fabian Ware's original notepad, and begin to understand the decisions that have been made over the 100-year existence. Now, should you search something, this is the kind of record you're going to begin to see. It could be a photograph, it could be a letter, as I said, of minutes of a meeting, and you'll get a brief description of exactly what that record entails. That might suffice, that might answer your question, but of course you can go in to our head office and look at this record in physical form. Which leads me to touch lastly on our archives. Now, our archives are still being added to. Every single day an important decision is made, whether that's a casualty that has just been uncovered on a battlefield, or whether that's something we're changing or adding on one of our existing sites. Either way, these photos represent that progress, that ongoing work. In the top left or right hand corner, you've got a brand new memorial we are building in Cape Town. Now, we have recently recognised that there are casualties that aren't currently under our care, and so we are establishing brand new memorials to make sure every casualty from all corners of the earth is properly commemorated, and that is a beginning of that. You can see in the other corner there's a photo. This is a school group in Africa. We've done an awful lot of engagement, whilst my work is mainly based in the UK, working with school groups in Africa to bring their attention to their history and the involvement of their ancestors during both world wars as well. And you can see I spoke about our extraordinary employees, our crafts personnel. You can see this individual is re-engraving part of a memorial. Now, I briefly mentioned recovery. It may surprise you to know that we still uncover casualties on the battlefields. Sadly, during construction projects, casualties will be discovered on plots of land. I recall that war was a chaotic thing. There wasn't always time to properly bury casualties or to give them a permanent marker where they could be rediscovered and properly buried. And so often we are taking names off our memorials to the missing. Our memorials to missing are, as they kind of say on the tin, a casualty that has no known grave. But if that casualty is discovered, best case scenario, we can take their name off a memorial to the missing and obviously give them a headstone in a cemetery somewhere close to where they were discovered. But as I say, this is a slide of the progress we have made in recent times and our ongoing work, which again, you can see on our website as we are constantly updating it with the fantastic work and the people that we are working with across the world. But on that note, I want to kind of tap a little bit further into the gems in our archives. And this brings me to this document here. Now, I spoke about the enormous work we had to undertake in the early stages of the commission. Now, the work in itself, building memorials and cemeteries, was difficult enough. But we also experienced a lot of other challenges. Naturally, we did, because this is a petition that was created by a lady called Lady Florence Cecil. Now, in the early days of the Imperial War Graves Commission, this idea of an organisation looking after all the casualties that died during the World War met a lot of resistance. Naturally, as we can all appreciate, someone we've had to grieve for, you want to care for. The cemeteries that we may visit or go around is a perfect example of how everyone has a different way they want their loved one commemorated. And therefore, an organisation that's begin to set about exactly how that person commemorated would meet a lot of resistance because everyone has their own interpretation. And for a lot of people, there was also a policy of non-repatriation. To put that into layman's terms, casualties weren't going to be brought back here to the UK or their country of origin. This decision was made for rather obvious logistical reasons, taking, whilst 1.7 million, we don't have every single casualties remains. That sheer scale of casualty would have been very, very difficult to travel, to take them back to places like Australia or back here in the UK. So that policy of non-repatriation met a lot of resistance because this idea that a grieving family, when they've had a loved one taken away from them, but they don't have any control over bringing that loved one back, that struck a lot of resistance. And this document, this petition was a kind of an example of that. So the petition itself was fighting for control over what type of headstone their loved one could have. Now, Lady Florence Cecil was in fact the wife of the Bishop of Exeter, and she had lost 3 sons herself, and she was arguing that headstones should have a cross on them, and they shouldn't be uniform in nature. But the thing is, we had to push back on this, and eventually, our designs factored in placing a cross on that headstone or having it removed based on the faith of that person. But it just shows a snapshot behind not just the casualties that we look after, but the grieving families that are behind every single headstone and name we look after as well. This petition, as you can see on screen, wasn't just filled with names. Sometimes there would be entire paragraphs of people trying to find an outlet for their grief. Now, it's at the time it was very difficult for them to see. With hindsight and the perspective we have, we can see what the Commission has achieved in 100 years, and the fact that we are able to introduce new generations to these casualties and their story is so important. But for a grieving family back then, it was incredibly difficult for them to comprehend this idea an organisation was going to control where their loved one was buried and how they were buried too. So it's a really sobering and interesting insight into those grieving families. And my next point kind of follows on from that, because this is a typical Commission headstone you can see on screen. It's very uniform in nature. Now this headstone isn't just any old headstone. This is Warrant Officer First Class William Nicklin. He is in fact buried within minutes of this hall, because he is buried at Milford-on-Sea churchyard. Now the reason I picked out his headstone in particular was because there's some text on the bottom. Now I apologise because it's slightly obscured by the plant on the bottom, but the reason I picked this out is because he has a personal inscription. Now this was the family's opportunity to personalise that headstone, which you can imagine any kind of family would grab with open arms. That opportunity to put their own words on that casualty's headstones. And in this case, the personal inscription reads, "To live on in the hearts of those who love and miss him is not to die." And whenever you see one of our headstones, I always recommend people to read them, because they give you that snapshot either into the person behind that headstone or the family behind that headstone. Now the document you can see on the right hand side, this is the form that family would have had to have filled in to decide what they wanted on their headstone. I'll say that very generally, but you can imagine a family sitting at a table together trying to decide what exactly was going to go on their headstone. And in this case, this is Private, forgive the pronunciation, Sobovinsky. Now he was Jewish, and you can see the Star of David on the bottom there, which would be placed the cross would be taken off and the Star of David would get placed on there instead. And you can see the text here, "Dearly mourned by sisters, brothers and friends." Again, another profound personal inscription, and a document that is available and viewable in our archives that gives you that snapshot into the family behind every single headstone and name that we look after. Now the other kind of gem from our archive I wanted to pull out is this. Now we have thousands of drawings. These are prospective sketches of sites and cemeteries that will be built in all corners of the world. And in this case, we have Fiorno della Chania War Cemetery in Italy. Now this particular drawing was actually sketched out by a gentleman called Louis de Soissons. Now he was one of a number of architects we had working with us. Another you may recognise, Edwin Lutyens, was one of our architects. If you don't recognise that name, I'm sure you'll know the cenotaph in central London, in Whitehall. Lutyens designed that cenotaph. He also designed a number of our sites, and he also designed Thiepval Memorial, where I had the pleasure of working at too. Now, Louis de Soissons, this is a perspective sketch, and I'd like to break this down a little bit because it shows you how much thought goes behind every single one of our sites. You can see he's carefully thought about the kind of plant or planting being done at these sites, because you want it to be respectful to those within it, but also be accessible by those visiting it too. So you'll notice the shrubs will get smaller, closer to the headstone, so when you enter and view that cemetery, you can see every headstone within it as well. Even nice little details like the car driving by and the gentleman leaning on the gate wall as well, I think are lovely touches. But this is a perspective sketch. Now, not all of these sketches made it into kind of physical form as we would see or experience them today, but I can show you this is very, very similar to that sketch. You can see the building on the left. The gentleman isn't standing at the gate on this occasion, but you can see how the shrubs surround the cemetery, and you've got smaller shrubs in the centre of the cemetery as well that do not obscure the headstones either. A small kind of fun fact for you is that We put smaller shrubs in front of the headstones, shrubs called splash shrubs. Essentially, they stop soil from splashing up onto the bottom of the headstone, but still make it a pleasant sight and make it, as many of our sites, look like a Garden of England too. Another example, we have thousands of photographs in our archives. Now, this particular cemetery is Étampes military cemetery in northern France. Now, Étampes was known for its military hospitals during both the First and the Second World War. Sadly, many casualties that were wounded on the front lines may have made it back to Étampes, having been transported by the British Red Cross from those front lines to a larger military hospital. Sadly, as you can see, many hundreds and thousands didn't make it. But that's what it looks like today. Now, that is the second largest cemetery that we look after in the world. That's got over 11,500 casualties in just one site. Now, I mentioned the cenotaph a moment ago. You'll notice, oops, I'm pressing the wrong clicker. Sorry, I'll go back there. You'll notice and maybe recognise a cenotaph looking like a piece of architecture just here, and that's because Lutchins had responsibility for designing this cemetery. And it is an absolutely extraordinary cemetery. I actually only visited there just towards the end of last year, but just to see the rows on rows on rows were just sobering, especially knowing that many of those casualties would have had grieving families, just like the ones I mentioned before as well. And to think, you know, those families would have numbered way greater than just every single individual. The impact, immeasurable. The other part of our archives is our staff records. Now, you probably think kind of what you're going on about. The fascinating part of our staff records is that many of our gardeners were in fact serving members of the armed forces themselves. Many gardeners, when the war concluded, the First World War concluded, actually were serving members coming back to look after their comrades in cemeteries, whether that be in northern France or Belgium. And Ernest Crankshaw is one such example. Now, you can see a photo of Ernest here, and this is his employee card. And he has quite an incredible story because he served with the Royal Army Medical Corps during the First World War. And he became a gardener with us in 1920. And he continued to garden with us until July of 1940. Now, that was, of course, smack bang during the Second World War. And sadly, he was imprisoned by the German forces, occupying the area he was gardening in at the time. Now, he was firstly imprisoned in Lille by the Germans. Then eventually he got taken all the way to a civilian internment camp in Poland. And it wasn't until the end of the war he was eventually transferred back to his garden, where he picked up his duties just as if he was doing them the day before, and he eventually retired in 1958 with us. But he is one of a number of gardeners that were serving members coming back to look after their comrades at the end of both world wars. We have a history of generations of people working for us. One member I actually met was fourth generation working for us, and he'd been serving the commission for over 40 years. And it just shows when you kind of get the bug of this extraordinary work you do, it is very hard to leave it, and I speak personally in that regard as well. Now finally, I mentioned accessing the archives. If you do want to access the archives, you can go online in order to book your place, and also, most importantly, book out the things you would like to view in our archives. But as I come to the end of this talk, I just want to round off with a couple of things. Firstly, to show you just how many sites are near you. Now, apologies, I know it's a little bit small, but I can assure you behind every single one of those green arrows is a site that has at least one casualty in it, be it churchyard, be it cemetery. And you can hopefully see some of the names around the edges. They'll be familiar local towns to you. You may pass through every day and not even realise there is a casualty in it. Now, I'll be very happy to put this slide back up at the end of the talk, but as I know time is pressing on, I will move on because I want to pick out one site in particular, and it's actually named up here. It's a site called Hollybrook Cemetery, and it's in relative sort of the north of Southampton, north of most of the ports. And the reason I want to talk about Hollybrook Cemetery is to talk about this personal story. Now, this is the ship called the SS Mendy. Now, SS stands for steamship, and it was responsible for transporting cargo and personnel throughout the course of the First World War. Now, the SS Mendy, it was in February of 1917 that it had just commenced a journey from Cape Town all the way back here to the UK. Its destination was Plymouth. And I can show you in a map just here. Its target was to stop at Plymouth. It was going to pick up further cargo and also pick up personnel as well. Now, this personnel were 600 members of the South African Native Labour Corps. Now, during the First World War, because of the casualties that were sustained, Britain had to turn to its empire to fill its ranks and fill the manpower needed to continue the fight and the effort on the front lines. And these men had travelled from Africa all the way up to Plymouth, and they were soon going to be on a journey to Le Havre in northern France, where they would then be transported to the places they were needed. Now, the SS Mendy left Plymouth. It was the early hours of the 21st of February 1917. It was being escorted by HMS Brisk because at the time the channel was infested with U-boat submarines and it needed protection. But bearing in mind this was the early hours of the morning, it was completely pitch black. To make matters worse, there was also a thick fog as well. Now, this meant that the SS Mendy and the HMS Brisk had to sail at extremely slow speed, sounding sometimes its foghorn to alert any ships nearby of its presence. Now, in those early hours of the morning, it began sailing to the point that was about 20 kilometres off the coast of the Isle of Wight, almost pretty much directly in line with where we are here, but a little further. Now, it was in those early hours that the SS Mendy was sighting in front of us, but bearing in mind it couldn't see very far, that out of absolutely nowhere, a ship twice the size came into full view. This is the SS Darrow. Similarly, a cargo ship, but twice the size of the SS Mendy. Now, sadly, because the SS Darrow not only came out of fog, it was sailing at full speed as well. The SS Darrow did not have time to react to change its course, nor did the SS Mendy, so the SS Darrow collided heavily with the SS Mendy. Now, naturally, the SS Mendy sustained heavy damage and began to sink. The SS Darrow continued on its course. And for all of the men that were aboard the South African Native Labour Corps, they would have naturally been sent into panic. Can you imagine standing on the top of a ship or being in its quarters, hearing a massive crash in the pitch black, in the fog? Now, bearing in mind, they would now have minutes to react. A lot of men were going to the edge of the boats, trying to get to lifeboats, but sadly, the SS Darrow had struck the SS Mendy on the side. It began to lean, which pretty much took out of action half of its lifeboats on one side. Now, you can imagine the chaos of those men aboard. A lot of these men, perhaps this would have been the first time they had ever sailed on a ship. They didn't know how to swim. The prospect of getting into freezing cold waters would have been frightening. This is all in the pitch black darkness. But amongst all of those figures was a gentleman called Reverend Isaac Diber. And you can see a photo of him standing up on screen. Now, this is partly what one might say legend. There's no fact to say this is exactly what he did. But there is a known fact that he got the men together. He got them standing in line, and he made the following speech. "Be quiet and calm, my countrymen, for what is taking place is exactly what you came to do. You are going to die, but it is what you came to do. Brothers, we are drilling the death drill. I, Akosa, say you are my brothers. Zulus, Swazis, Pondos, Basutus, and all others, let us die like warriors. We are the sons of Africa. Raise your war cries, my brothers. For though they made us leave our assegais back in our kraals, Our voices are left with our bodies. That evening, over 600 lives were lost. Now, many of those lives have been documented in publications, keen interest, because this was the single, and continues to be the single largest South African loss of civilian casualties ever in history. Now, this ship, its wreckage, was in waters off the coast of Isle of Wight, and fortunately, in more recent times, it was protected and dived on for artefacts to be displayed in museums around the world to ensure their story and their sacrifice is never forgotten. And you can see two artefacts here. You've got a porthole of the ship, and you've also got a plate which enabled divers to identify this ship as the SS Mendy. Now, this is Hollybrook Memorial. Now, the actual site of Hollybrook is made up of both a cemetery and a memorial, and on that memorial is a memorial to the missing, is well over 600 names of the South African Native Labour Corps casualties that lost their lives on that fateful evening. Now, one thing I'd like to add is, in a continuation of this talk, this year I'm going to be doing an event at Hollybrook in May. I'm going to be talking about their story once again, along with many other tales that are on that memorial and in that cemetery. It's a small fact that also Kitchener himself is commemorated on that memorial too. So if you're interested in continuing what you've hopefully enjoyed tonight into an event, just look on our website or search Hollybrook events, Hollybrook Cemetery events, and it hopefully should pop up. I can always pass the details to your members as well through email. But I wanted to tell this story because it's another story of people that came from a completely different corner of the world to fight in a completely different country. They had no experience or life in what these men and what thousands of others would have had to have done is adapt to different cultures. Another perfect example, and I've worked with Chris a lot on this, is the Indian soldiers that were based here in the New Forest. Another example of the Commonwealth sacrifice made during the First World War. Now, for the reason I told this story, we must now too raise our voices to ensure that stories like this are never forgotten. And on that note, I want to say thank you very much once again for the opportunity to speak with you. It's been an enormous pleasure, and I'm very happy to take any questions now. You will see on screen as well other ways of continuing your interest in whether that be casualties locally or my organisation. You can see lots of opportunities on there. But otherwise, thank you very much. I'll pass back to Chris.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm mindful of the time, but I will say we'll take a couple of questions if you have them. If not, and you would prefer to talk to Will during the refreshments, then I'm more than happy that way, and I'm sure he is as well. So are there any questions, or shall we leave it for you to come up to? Yes, David.
First of all, very thoughtful and interesting
Thank you.
talk, so thank you for that. Where do you get all your funding from?
So our funding, we have 6 member governments. And those 6 member governments, the UK government, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, India and Canada. They provide us funding in proportion to the number of casualties we care for. So if it's a Canadian casualty, for instance, it's the Canadian government that provide us with that funding. That will be the upkeep of the headstone, cemetery or memorial that that person is commemorated in. To give you kind of sense, our annual budget is around £60 million a year. But when you spread that across 150 different countries, it becomes an awful lot smaller, but of course facilitates all the work of our employees across the world. Does that answer your question? Yes. Awesome. Does anyone else have any other questions? Yes.
I think it looked like you find about 36 bodies a year.
So it really does vary. Sorry, did you?
So the question was, how easy is it to identify them?
So firstly, the point of the number of casualties, it can vary depending on, quite simply, how much construction work is going on. If there's a lot of work being done on the battlefield, we'll naturally expect to find more casualties than less. Now, in terms of the identification, that is another difficult. It really depends, as brutally as I put it, what state we find the casualty in. If it's, well-preserved casualty, we'll, of course, look for means of identifying them, whether that's a badge to identify who they served with, or whether that's a personal item that they've inscribed their service number on. That's, the best case scenario. But you add in factors as well that naturally soldiers swap pieces of kit with one another too. So it adds another layer of complexity of how much we can fully attest that this is Private John Atkins that we have found. But we have a dedicated recovery team that will go out to recover those casualties, produce a report on what's discovered, liaise with the relevant government if a nationality is identified, and also a team that will make sure that any family members are informed if we can trace family members. And I've had the pleasure of attending a rededication service where someone was discovered, a name was taken off a memorial, added to a headstone, and it was extraordinary. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Does anyone else?
Claire.
Have you ever come across someone who's been buried in a war cemetery but they didn't die in service?
Okay. So, firstly, I should clarify for everyone else's understanding. We do have set parameters of who we identify as a casualty under our care. Those parameters are both in date, and also that casualty would have to be a serving member of a recognised armed force, and their death be the result of that service. Now, obviously, with the 100 years of our existence, there's a saying that I've always got quite accustomed to saying, there's always an exception, and clearly we've got an exception here.
That's
And-
lovely.
And I should say, whilst that is a rare example, whilst we have regimented ways of doing things and certain ways to go about cemeteries, we also recognise that there are human beings behind every single casualty. There's another sort of example that is very locally to here, is local to here, Brockenhurst Military Cemetery, where a family actually visited their son from, their son was a New Zealander. They'd come all the way over from New Zealand, and through a special permission, we'd had a little plaque placed to record their visit from halfway around the world, that only visit when they got to visit their son. And so, we will make exceptions, and in that case, I'm very glad that we did make that exception, because, and I think, with a lot of our cemeteries, whilst, I mentioned earlier there was an awful lot of resistance to families not having a say on how they're buried, ultimately, when you see the rows on rows, they've all been buried how they fought together and died together. Ultimately, they were all friends fighting beside one another. I think it couldn't be more fitting that they're buried in the same way as well. But thank you for that story, that was amazing.
Well, if I may, on your behalf, may I once again thank Will for absolutely fascinating story and details on the work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And I'm sure that while you're having your refreshments, if you want to come and speak to Will, he'll happily answer any more questions. But on behalf of us all, Will, thank you so much. Thank you.